Hi and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos, I'm taking a look at David Lewis's book on the plurality of worlds. And we have progressed as far as halfway through the second chapter, which is the chapter in which David Lewis considers certain counterarguments against his own theory of modality. The first several counter-arguments were supposed to be arguments that showed that his theory was impossible, incoherent, didn't make any sense. The second set of counter-arguments to which we now turn are counter-arguments that are supposed to show that if you accept David Lewis's theory of modality, some really weird consequences follow, or maybe some really undesirable consequences follow, and that might be a reason to not accept his theory. Right, and so what Lewis is going to do is he is going to argue in all of these instances that there's actually nothing sort of wrong with his theory. In some cases, he's going to tell us that there's literally no price that he has to pay, and in the final instance, he's going to tell us that, yeah, there is a price, but it's worth paying it. Okay, so let's look at what is going on. And the section I'm going to start with is section 2.5, called A Road to Skepticism. So what is this road to skepticism? Well, it has to do with inductive skepticism, right? With the idea that although we have observed maybe certain regularities in nature, we might not have any justification for believing that the future is going to be like the past, or that more in general, the unobserved things in the world are going to be like the observed things in the world, right? This can apply just as much to the past as to the future, to things that are distant or otherwise unobserved. So why would Lewis's theory of modality, right, this theory of all these possible worlds, why would that invite the problem of induction? Why would people say that if you accept Lewis's theory of modality, then you are sort of forced into inductive skepticism? Well, the idea is that there are all these possible worlds, right? And there are lots of possible worlds. It was very important for Lewis that any world you can imagine, really, any world you can create using his principle of recombination, which tells us that anything can be combined with anything else in space and time, as long as it, sort of fits in space and time. So this principle that anything can be combined with anything else, and that all these possible worlds where anything is combined with anything else really exist, that seems to sort of present the inductive skeptical worry with the greatest possible force. So Lewis is committed to the following claim, right? Suppose that the world has been just as we have seen it happen right up until now. There's all these nice regularities. Things have been happening the way that they've been happening. Okay, what can happen next? Anything, right? Anything can happen next. I am currently sitting here in a yellow t-shirt that says Papasaurus, talking to you about David Lewis. And what can happen next is that I will continue this story in a way that sort of makes sense. What can also happen is that I suddenly start telling you a completely different story, which doesn't make any sense. What can also happen is that I suddenly turn into a crocodile. What can also happen is that everything in the world gets annihilated, and instead there is a world composed only of, gigantic balls of liquid fire. Well, that's actually pretty much like our world. Gigantic balls of liquid gold, just zoning out, like flying through space in all kinds of directions, doing nothing, and then suddenly that all disappears and it gets replaced by one little paradise island in an infinitely large ocean on which two unicorns are kissing each other. I don't know. I mean, all of that is possible, right? All of that is possible. And in fact, David Lewis is going to say, all of that happens. in one or another possible world. Anything that the principle of recombination allows, and the principle of recombination allows everything that's possible, which for Lewis is, all of these weird scenarios, all of these counterinductive scenarios, all of these scenarios in which our inductive conclusions do not hold. Now, all of those scenarios happen somewhere in the pluriverse of possible worlds. And so, what reason do we have to believe that we live in one of the worlds that's just going to continue the way we expect it to continue, rather than in one of those many, many, many possible worlds in which things just go bonkers and totally different things start happening, which might have literally nothing to do with anything that came before. All right, what is Lewis going to say about this? Well, what he is going to say about it is that, yes, induction is a real problem, but it's everyone's problem. It's not his problem, like not his problem more than anyone else's problem. It's not because of anything he has said that we are in this inductive trouble, and therefore it's no argument against his theory. So let's read what Lewis writes on page 117. He says, I have no intention of becoming a skeptic. What we call inductive reason is rightly so called. It's rightly called reason. And I, as a modal realist, have no more reason to forsake inductive reason than anyone else has. I do have the reason that everyone else has, and I agree with common opinion that this reason is insufficient. And now we come to something that's very important and very, very wrong. The reason that everyone has is that induction is fallible. It is possible, and it is possible in very many ways, that by being reasonable, we shall be led into error. So the reason that everyone has is that induction is fallible. It is not true that inductive skepticism follows from the fact that induction is fallible. The point that, for instance, David Hume shows to be true about induction, given that you think about it in the way that Hume thinks about it and in the way that David Lewis thinks about it, is not so much that although you have good reasons to, get to a particular conclusion, still, it's fallible. In some maybe exceptional circumstances, things might go differently. Right? That's not the problem. I mean, that wouldn't lead to skepticism. All that would show is that we're not certain, but it would still be the case that we have good reasons maybe to draw inductive conclusions. What Hume suggests is that we have no reasons at all. Right? I mean, Hume famously tells us that induction is not based on reason, but only on custom. And that's because he takes himself to have shown that there is literally no reason at all to prefer one conclusion about what's going to happen next to any other conclusion about what's going to happen next, because there are no necessary connections. Anything can follow anything else. And Lewis would seem to be in the exact same position. Right? According to the principle of recombination, anything can follow anything else. There's no sort of inherent connection that makes some of these ties more likely or more natural or anything like that. Right? It's not the case that me being here in a yellow shirt is somehow intrinsically connected to the next moment also containing a philosopher guy in a yellow shirt talking about David Lewis. There's no intrinsic connection like that at all. Anything can happen after anything else. And so it's not merely a matter of fallibility. It's a matter of there literally being no connection between what we have experienced and what happens at other times and places that we haven't yet experienced. There's literally no metaphysical connection between those. Anything can follow anything else. In fact, anything does follow anything else, according to Lewis. And so there are no reasons, it would seem, consider, if we really consider how things are, there are no reasons to live in one way or think that one thing is going to happen instead of something else. Right? If there's anything we might call a reason, it's something like custom, or it's something like, I don't know, even pragmatic is not the right word. It's not that we pragmatically believe that things are gonna remain the way that they remain, because in order to see what is pragmatic, we would already have to, in order to see what is useful, we would already have to presuppose that there is some solid, unchanging context in which we can make judgments of usefulness. All right, so what I want to say is that it's not mere fallibility, right? Everybody agrees that induction is fallible. It's not mere fallibility that gives us the problem of induction and inductive skepticism. What gives us the problem of induction and inductive skepticism is the claim that anything can follow anything else, right? So that nothing that we experience can give us any reason to believe that something else has to happen later on. So, is Lewis right that everyone faces the problem of induction? No. Well, Lewis is right in claiming that his modal realism is not the source of the problem of induction. Right? It doesn't matter whether, as Lewis, you believe that all the possible worlds are real, or whether, as somebody who follows the possible world approach, as somebody who accepts the principle of recombination, but who doesn't accept modal realism, you believe that only one world is real, but all the other ones are possible. Right? That doesn't matter. So, in that respect, Lewis is right. Right? The problem of induction is not a problem specifically for modal realism, but it is a problem that follows from the principle of recombination, right? From this idea that anything can follow from anything else. So it is Lewis's idea of what is possible, not of what is real, but of what is possible, namely all these worlds where anything follows anything else. It's his idea of what is possible that forces him into inductive skepticism. And frankly, for me, think that Lewis's sort of cavalier attitude here in saying, but I'm not a skeptic. I mean, who cares about the problem of induction? I think that is a failure to face up to the consequences of accepting the principle of recombination. You can get out of the problem of induction, but it involves not accepting the principle of recombination. Right? It requires you to believe in the existence of necessary connections. It requires you to not follow Hume in that respect. And that would, allow you to have a different way of thinking about induction and a different way of thinking about what is possible. Right? You can disagree with Lewis about what is possible. You could say that it is not possible that I suddenly disappear and a crocodile appears in my place, or we all suddenly disappear and there's only these balls of molten gold. If you think that that's not possible, that there are far fewer possibilities than Lewis countenances, then you might be able to say certain things that could get you out of the problem of induction. Right? If you accept the principle of recombination, then you're never going to get out of the problem of induction. So I don't think that Lewis is right in saying that what we have here is not an argument against modal realism, but he is wrong in suggesting that it is not an argument against his principle of recombination. And that is not on the table. Right? It's not like the idea that the principle of recombination might be wrong. The idea that there is something wrong with the Humean claim that anything can follow anything else, that is not really on the table in this book. Even though it is maybe, I don't know whether it's the one most fateful assumption that Lewis makes, but it's certainly a very fateful assumption. All right, so Lewis has some, technically okay stuff about whether you could make the claim that there are more weird counterinductive worlds than ordered inductive, like nice inductive worlds. And he basically suggests that if you think about how infinities work, you can't really make that kind of claim. And I guess we would have to agree with him about that. But it doesn't really address the problem that the principle of recombination just takes away any reason. It takes away any reason to take our experience to be evidence for what we haven't experienced. Right? There's no way you can get that back. Once you are a Humean, this is not an uncontroversial take, but it's my take. Once you are a Humean, once you believe that anything can follow anything else, like the problem of induction is going to destroy reason. As Hume himself happily accepted. I mean, it's like Hume himself is sort of a happy skeptic, right? I mean, Hume himself isn't bothered by the problem of induction. Hume himself says, yeah, you know, skepticism, like the kind of ancient skepticism where as a skeptic you're like, I'm never sure about anything, I never really know anything, and that's fine with me, it makes me calm and happy. That is sort of the Humean attitude. It's not Lewis's attitude, right? It's not Lewis's attitude. And I think that the kind of thing that Lewis wants to have is something that as a Humean he cannot possibly have. All right, section 2.6. Now we get to an ethical argument, a road to indifference. So here is something that, and this is something that the arguments in 2.7 and 2.6 share with each other. Both of them sort of zoom in on the fact that according to Lewis, what is real is, there's nothing arbitrary about it, right? What is real is the full plenitude of everything. Everything that's possible is real. Everything that could exist does exist. Like there's no such thing as an unactualized possibility, as a possibility that is not somewhere real. And so we have this sort of, well, you can think of it as a sort of the full multiverse of possibilities, and it's all just there. Okay, here is one thing that you might think that this implies. If it's all just there, if anything that could possibly happen happens, well, what does it matter what I do? Right? Because maybe I can make two choices, A or B. And maybe I choose A. But that just means that there's another possible world where somebody chooses B. Right? Somebody who is just like me in every respect. So that person chooses B. On the other hand, if I choose B, well, that just means that I am the person in that other possible world. And there is still this, first possible world in which somebody chooses A. So the very notion of choice and the very notion of moral choice a fortiori seems to make no sense in this Lewisian multiverse in which all the possible worlds are real. Right? It would be different if only one world is real, because then my choices go into the equation that defines which world it is. But no, I mean, they're all real. So there is a sense in which it doesn't matter what I choose, because the sum total of reality is just there. It's just what it is, and no one can make a difference to it. So here is the footnote that Williams writes in, or says on page 123, that Lewis's view is complete fatalism because the sum total of being is absolutely necessary. All right, what does Lewis say about this? Well, what Lewis says is that, all of that is in a sense true, but to conclude from it that it doesn't matter what I do is wrong. Why? Well, when does it matter what I do? It matters when I want something, right? If I want to be happy, and I have two choices, and one of them is going to make me happy, and the other is going to make me unhappy, I had better choose the first one, which makes me happy. Okay, what if somebody says, okay, maybe you want to choose the thing that makes you happy and be happy, but that just means that there's another possible world where somebody makes the other choice and becomes unhappy. Yeah, all right, Lewis says, but my wish to be happy is a wish that I will be happy. It's not a wish that somebody else in some possible world over there is happy. So my desires are egocentric, right? They're about me. And maybe not just about me. I mean, this is not about egoism. They could also be about my friends, my loved ones, my family, even maybe all of the people on Earth, this Earth, right? The Earth that I'm living on. And my choices, they seem to have an effect on that, right? I mean, what I choose makes a difference to what happens to me and to the other people in this world. And that is where my desires are located. My desires are egocentric. They're not desires about the sum totality of possible worlds. And so if somebody says that desires about the sum totality of possible worlds don't make any sense, that's right. But my desires are not like that. They are egocentric. They are desires about me and my friends and this possible world. And it makes perfect sense to try and get what I wish within the possible world that I am part of. So does that response make any sense? Well, yeah, I would say that what it shows, I think that Lewis sort of successfully shows that it still makes sense to talk about desires and pursuing those desires, even in the context of something like modal realism. Whether it really touches on sort of the underlying, I don't know whether intuition is the right word, but sort of the underlying worry that there is something fatalist about the story, that there is something insupportable about the idea that everything that is possible is, that everything, like every bad thing that you could possibly think of is real, that nothing can be prevented, that all possible pain is real pain, and so on and so forth. I don't know. I don't really think that Lewis delves into that. I don't know whether he has the resources to delve into that. Certainly not sort of in the kind of very theoretical metaphysics that he is working with here. I don't know whether he can delve into sort of the almost existential dread that I think speaks from a sentence like, it is complete fatalism because the sum total of being is absolutely necessary. And of course, I mean, there are some good questions to be asked here. Questions like whether you can even conceive of yourself as somebody who acts and who chooses if you know that the sum total of reality is unalterable and just there. And these are very deep metaphysical questions that Lewis doesn't seem to be very interested in here. So I think he at least succeeds in sort of the minimal task of suggesting that at least prima facie it makes sense to have these egocentric desires and therefore to not be indifferent. You want to be the person who lives in the possible world where things are nice, right? But I don't think he maybe faces the full-scale problem, or that he even wants to face the full-scale problem, or manages to get out what the full-scale problem is or might be. Here's something else. Lewis tells us, for instance, the following. This is page 127. Your virtuous desire to do good and not evil has nothing to do with the sum total of good and evil throughout reality. It has to do with what befalls you and your world mates. And that makes some sense, unless we keep in mind what the previous paragraph taught us, right? Paragraph 2.5 about the problem of induction and the principle of plenitude. What does the principle of plenitude tell me? Well, suppose that I have virtuous desires, right? Up till now I have virtuous desires, and after that anything can happen. Or suppose that I have evil desires. So up to now I have evil desires, and after that anything can happen. So for every world where I have virtuous desires and then do something virtuous, there is another world in which I have exactly those same virtuous desires and then I do something very, very evil. And for every world where I have very evil desires and then do something evil, there is a world where I have evil desires and then do something virtuous. I mean, all of the combinations are equally real. And so while Lewis tells me that my virtuous desires have something to do with what befalls me and my world mates, this is actually not clear at all. Right? I mean, if we take the principle of recombination seriously, nothing has any consequences for what happens next. Right? I mean, having virtuous desires is in no way even an indication of whether I'm going to do anything virtuous later on. Because there are also all these worlds where I, have the most virtuous desires of the world and then go on a mass-killing rampage. So I don't know whether Lewis is even allowed to say this. But that is more a problem that comes back to the problem of induction rather than one about indifference specifically. Section 2.7, arbitrariness lost. This is not so much a counter-argument, but more something that Lewis kind of wants to mention and get out of the way. He wants to point out that it turns, if you're a modal realist, there really is no such thing as arbitrariness. Anything that can happen happens. All contingency, all all the things that happen, even though something else could have happened too, are only, true in a sort of egocentric way. Like, it might be sort of, from my egocentric perspective, it is contingent that that this pen falls down rather than flying away, I guess. It's not contingent that there is a world where the pen falls down. And it's also not contingent that there's another world where the pen flies away, and so on and so forth. This is not really a counter-argument. It's more sort of showing that we have to be wary when we think about contingency. There is a sense in which everything in Lewis's multiverse is necessary. And if we want to recover our normal ways of thinking about contingency and everything that has to do with that, randomness and so on and so forth, we have to be careful in thinking about it in something like an egocentric or world-centric perspective. So finally, paragraph 2.8, in a very well-known locution, Lewis tells us that he has often met, when defending his modal realism, with not so much counter-arguments as the incredulous stare. Right? People are just like, every possible world exists. Like, that's your theory? That was the incredulous stare. Okay, what does Lewis do? He says, look, I know that what I'm saying doesn't really fit common sense very well, right? It's a big departure from common sense. It's not that people go around saying, oh, I don't believe in a plurality of possible worlds. But when you were to tell them something like, hey, there is a plurality of possible worlds, all these worlds, they're real, they're probably not going to go like, oh yeah, I always thought that. They're going to go like, what? What? Huh? Why would I believe that? Okay, Lewis says, I think that's a bit of a price. We would like to stay close to our intuitions, to what we, usually think. But it's a price well worth paying because of everything that we saw in chapter 1. Right? In chapter 1, we saw all the ways that modal realism solves philosophical problems. In chapter 2, we saw that there are no real counter-arguments, according to Lewis. And so, it's a price worth paying. Right? Yes, it's a price. It is a bit strange, my theory. You might be incredulous when you first hear it, but just look at all the advantages. See how small the disadvantages are. We should accept my theory. Provided, of course, and this is the last sentence of chapter 2, provided, of course, that these advantages cannot be had for less. And that is what's going to bring us to the second half of the book, in which Lewis is going to spend a lot of time thinking about, this is like the topic of chapter 3, thinking about alternatives. Those alternatives are going to be alternatives to modal realism that take possible worlds, the possible worlds approach to modality for granted, but are going to try to give a different interpretation of what a possible world is. And so we'll see about those when we get to chapter 3 in our next video.